When I was young, long, long ago, there was a magazine called Fate. It was one of the only ones of its kind at that time, and dealt with true accounts of the strange and unknown. Things like aliens and flying saucers, sasquatches, ancient astronomy, spirit possession, miracle healing, and all those things that go bump in the night when nobody's listening. Now, I was brought up in a, let's say, non believing household, and though I've always been fascinated by those things, I've always thought of them as more related to the psychology and the infinite ability of the human mind to delude itself. As far as I could see, there was no place for those things in the universe that I knew. And yet, Fate magazine had a regular feature called My Proof of Survival, where readers would send in their own encounters with the shades of departed friends and relations. Here is mine. In 1972, when I was 19, my father had recently been hired as professor of education at McGill University in Montreal. And one morning he was doing his exercises, 1, 2, touch your toes, when he suddenly said to my mother, "Barb," he said, "you better call the ambulance. I think I'm having a heart attack." And he collapsed on the bed. So she called the ambulance, but despite the best efforts of the attendants, he died. And he told me about it afterwards, watching as they put him on the bed, the doctors desperately trying to bring him back to life, and he looked up, way up, and he saw not the hospital ceiling, but the classic vision of the dead and dying, the tunnel of light, stretching off in the distance far above him, and all the old people who had gone before him, playing the old familiar hymns on the old family piano and saying, "Come on, come on." And he started floating up and into that tunnel, and he felt so peaceful when, bam, he was back in his body again, in excruciating pain, and cursing the doctors who applied the electric shocks that revived him. But he finally accepted his second chance at life. In fact, it gave him an excellent excuse. Whenever somebody wanted him to do something he didn't want to do, he would just put his hand on his chest and say, "Regrets, my heart." He was there for some weeks, and before he went home, they planted a pacemaker in him, which would restart that heart if it ever stopped again. Now, after that, he became more, well, not really religious, but maybe spiritual. He went on to become head of the Northern Institute of McGill and spent much of his time flying to remote Aboriginal communities, working with native teachers to develop and deliver educational programs in their own languages. He also traveled far and wide in the world, outside Canada. He studied Siberian education in the USSR. He spent a year in Cambridge as visiting professor. He had an institute named after him in Peru, quite well known all around. Anyway, I got my own Master's of Education in 1984 at the same faculty of McGill. There was a ceremony in May of that year, which he would have attended if he'd not been off on one of his many northern adventures. And 2 years after that, in 1986, at Iqaluit in Baffin Island, the pacemaker failed during the night and they didn't have the facilities to restart it. So he died for real that time, and he's now buried in the Magdalen Islands and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but that's another story. So, 4 years after that, in 1990, McGill decided that, due to all his good works, they would name an auditorium in the education building after him. I was living in Toronto at the time, but came down to Montreal for the dedication. My wife Roma and I spent the night in my mother's house, and the next morning I was in the back room looking for something to read to pass the time before the ceremony. And there, on the shelf, was a book called Calculus. Now, neither he nor I, as far as I knew, had ever had much interest in that topic, but I pulled it down and opened it at random, and stuck in that page there was a note, written by my father and addressed to me, and dated when I would have received my master's degree. It's in rather bad shape now, but I finally laminated it, and it should survive a while longer, and here it is. May 4th, 1984. Nino, that's what my father calls me. How proud we are of you. Happy Ahmed. Wish I was here to be on the stage and wink at you. Next time for sure. Hope the ceremony's brief and brilliant. They seldom are either, but maybe this time. Much love, dear Nee, and to our beautiful Roma. See you one of these days, somewhere. Much love, Daddy. And that afternoon the family went to the dedication of the Jack Cram Auditorium at McGill. I don't remember if the ceremony was either brief or brilliant, but there on the wall was a big photo of himself, winking down at the crowd.